And just to remind you, this was the game that we saw last time. So when we look at static games, a game that I really expect you to be able to fall back on really, really quickly, be able to reproduce, know the implications of that game, is the Prisoner's Dilemma. When we look at dynamic games, a game that I really expect you to know is this game of market entry. It was this idea: we've got an incumbent firm and a challenger. The challenger, just to recap from last week, is thinking about entering the market and setting up in competition against the incumbent firm who's already producing. If the challenger does choose to enter the market, then the incumbent firm needs to make a choice. Does it acquiesce? Does it step back and allow the challenger to enter the market uncontested? Or does it fight market entry? Does it, for example, adopt an aggressive pricing strategy? So those are the two choices of the incumbent firm if market entry does occur. Now we set this game up and we rank the various outcomes. The worst possible scenario is for where they both get a payoff of 0, is for both the challenger and the incumbent to get involved in a price war. The incumbent responds to market entry by fighting, by cutting prices. Profits of both firms are driven all the way down to 0. That's not what they want. The most preferred outcome for the challenger is that it enters the market and the incumbent firm acquiesces. It gets its most preferred payoff of 2. For the incumbent firm, its most preferred payoff, where it gets the payoff of 2, is where the challenger stays out of the market altogether. So that was the game that we set up. And we use that process of backwards induction. We argued through it intuitively, but we've also done that more formal mechanism of backwards induction. And the outcome, the sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium of this game, is where the challenger enters. And regardless of what the incumbent says, regardless of all the posturing and the threats to fight market entry, it won't do it. It will always concede market entry, it will acquiesce, and so our sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium is that outcome there, where the challenger enters the market and the incumbent responds by acquiescing. So that's the sub-game perfect outcome, sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. But look at those outcomes. For the challenger, it's fine. It gets its most preferred outcome. It gets a payoff of 2. It couldn't do any better. For the incumbent firm, it only gets a payoff of 1. That's its second most preferred outcome. The incumbent would much rather be here, where the challenger stays out of the market altogether, and it gets its most preferred outcome. Now, how could it do that? Well, the only way it could do that is by making a threat. Threatening the incumbent: if you enter the market, absolutely, I will fight market entry. And it needs to make this threat credible. Is that going to happen, though? The problem is, it does not matter what the incumbent says. As soon as market entry has occurred, it might say that it's going to fight, but it isn't going to. As soon as the challenger enters the market, the optimal response, the logical response from the incumbent, is to acquiesce. And that's why we get the sub-game perfect outcome. Because the incumbent firm cannot make a credible commitment to fight. And hence, it cannot get its most preferred outcome. However, there is something that we can do, and this relates to the idea of commitment, and it's a topic that we're going to bring ourselves back together at the end of our next topic, which is repeated games. But for the moment, I want to give you a gentle introduction, a first port of call of this idea of commitment, and how credible threats can be made. But I'm going to give you a slightly different example. It isn't a slightly different example, it's the exact same example. The nature of the game, the incentives that players face, the outcomes of the game are all exactly the same. I'm just, though, going to put it in the context of a slightly different example for the moment. So, in this example, art was never my strong point in school, and you can probably guess by these diagrams that I've drawn. So we have two countries. We've got country 1 and country 2. And between these two countries is an island. And this island is connected to both of the mainland by a bridge. Now, both country 1 and country 2 want to occupy this island. They want it to be theirs. Now, the current situation is that country 2 occupies the island. Their army is situated on the island. But army 1, or country 1, isn't happy about this. It wants to occupy the island. But only one of the countries can occupy the island at the same time. So that's our general game then. So that's the way that it's set up. Army 2 is currently on the island, and Army 1 isn't happy about it. It wants to occupy the island. So what does it do? Does it stay put? Does it do nothing? Accept the status quo that it doesn't control the island? Or does it do something about it? Does it choose to invade the island? So that's the first choice. Army 1, or country 1, is making that decision. Does it stay put, or does it invade? Now, if it stays put, nothing changes. The game ends, and we stay where we are. If it chooses to invade, though, then Army 2 has a choice. As I said, only one of the countries can occupy the island at the same time. So, Army 1 goes across the bridge to the island. Then these two armies potentially will be in conflict. So, Army 2 then needs to make a choice. Does it retreat back over the bridge and concede the island to its rival? Or does it instead stay and fight? So those are the two options. Does it fight or does it retreat? So that's the game, that's the dynamic game that we've described. Army 1 moves first. Does it stay or does it invade? If it does invade, then Army 2 needs to make a choice. Does it retreat or does it fight? So that sets our game up in its dynamic form. Two players are taking it in turns to move. Now, in terms of the outcomes of this game, the absolute worst possible scenario is that these two armies get involved in an armed conflict with one another. Neither of them wants that. That will give them their worst possible outcome. But in terms of the best scenario, this differs between both countries. The best scenario for both countries is that they occupy the island. Remember, only one of these can occupy the island at a given point in time. So that's the game that we've set up. Now, if you think about what I've said here, and again, even if you think about some of the language that I've used, hopefully you should now appreciate that this game is actually, the incentives within this game, the nature of the game, is exactly the same as that game of market entry. It's exactly the same. So were we to represent it in its extensive form, using our game tree, this is what we've got. So Army 1 makes the first choice. Does it invade, or does it not invade? If it does choose to invade, then we come to the choice node of Army 2, and it then has the choice to either retreat or fight. And these outcomes, we said the worst possible scenario is where they both get involved in an armed conflict. They both get payoff of 0. But the most preferred, we've then got a 1 and a 2. The most preferred outcome for Army 2 is that Army 1 chooses not to invade. The most preferred outcome for Army 1 is that it invades and Army 2 retreats. Then it gets its most preferred outcome of 2. That's just me encapsulating everything I've said before. This, I've changed the label slightly, but this is the exact same game. It's, do you stay out of the market or do you enter the market? Do you acquiesce or do you fight? And then those outcomes are exactly the same. Now, given that that's the exact same game of market entry, what's going to be the sub-game perfect outcome, sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium? It's going to be where Army 1 invades and Army 2 responds by retreating. Because Army 2 will say it will fight. If you come over here, we're not going to allow you onto something. We want to control it. We will fight you if you come across. It might make this threat, but we've seen it is not the optimal choice. Once the invasion has occurred, to fight market entry. It will always choose to retreat. It cannot make a credible threat to fight. Hence, that is our subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. And what does it mean? It means that Army 1 gets its most preferred outcome of 2, but Army 2 doesn't get its most preferred outcome. It would much rather be over here. It needs to convince Army 1, if you come over, absolutely, I'm going to fight. So at the moment, doesn't matter what it does. Doesn't matter what it says, that is just not a credible commitment to fight. So absolutely, we know what the subgame perfect outcome is going to be. But there is something that Army 2 can do to make that commitment to fight credible. And what it could do is burn the bridge between the island and its mainland. So if it did that, what would happen if Army 1 invaded? Army 2 can't retreat. We've now removed that as a viable option. It's got no other choice but to stay on the island and fight. And so, removing that as an option then changes the very nature of this game, the dynamics of this game, the outcome of this game. So now, given that retreat is no longer an option, that threat there, that option to fight is credible. So, now think what would happen with Army 1. It's got the choice. Does it invade, knowing that retreating from Army 2 is not an option? So if it does invade, the only thing that Army 2 can do is fight. So it gets a payoff of 0. Alternatively, if Army 1 chooses not to invade, it will get a payoff of 1. And of these two outcomes, which would it prefer? A payoff of 0 or a payoff of 1? Obviously, 1 is preferred to 0. And so, it will choose not to invade. And so, what we find is we now get a different subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. Because that threat, that commitment to fight has now been made credible. But the only way it's been made credible, though, is by this process of burning bridges, removing one of the options. Because if that bridge was in place, if this deliberate action hadn't been taken by Army 2, you would get a different subgame perfect outcome. So, as I said, we're going to return to this in a much fuller sense later in the course. But I just want to give one final example to tease out this idea of burning bridges. That I know when we set the module up, first of all, and I said we would run through a very, very stylised set of examples. But what I want to do is show how this idea of burning bridges is a very common practice, not just in the real world, in economic situations, but also business situations as well. And it's a strategy that firms do use. Now, the way in which they do this, well, it's not literally burning bridges. They don't go down and burn things of their rivals. But what they do is use long-term binding contracts for the exact same purpose. To make credible their commitment, often to fight market entry. It's used as a deterrence tool. And I'll give you a stylised example. Let's say that we've got two off-licences. We've got threshers and odd bins. And we're going to set this up in exactly the same way as that game of market entry. So we've got an incumbent firm and we've got a challenger. Now the incumbent firm is going to be threshers. The potential entrant is going to be odd bins. So threshers is within the market, it's selling in a certain location, along a certain line, and it's happy. It's got a certain market share. Odd bins, though, as now a potential rival, has seen a business opportunity, and it wants some of threshers' markets. So what does it do? It says, okay, I now want to come into this market. I'm going to enter and compete against you. Well, we've already seen in that game of market entry, it does not matter what Thresher says, it might threaten as much as it likes to fight market entry. But as soon as odd bins enters the market, its segment of the market, what will Threshers do? It will acquiesce. It makes no sense whatsoever to fight market entry. And so, odd bins will enter the market. And Threshers doesn't want that. It wants to keep the market to itself. So what can it do? Well, it can sign a long-term binding contract. So let's say that Threshers has such a contract with suppliers of Bordeaux wine. Each and every month, it's committed to buying a certain quantity of wine. It's legally committed. It's signed a long-term contract. Now imagine this situation. Oddbins threatens to enter the market, to start competing against Threshers. So, Threshers would say, well, I've got this long-term contract. I'm committed to buying all this wine. I need to sell this wine. I can't have unsold stocks of wine, and I can't buy less wine from the suppliers. Therefore, if market entry does occur, Threshers would have no choice but to fight market entry. Its hands would be bound. So in this sense, you can see we've achieved the exact same principle. This long-term binding contract has achieved exactly the same outcome. It's altered the sub-game perfect outcome of this game. Without that contract, market entry would occur. Threshers would find that its market share, its profits would be eroded. But by pre-committing itself to buying this wine, it removes the option of conceding to market entry. So it's, in that sense, it's exactly the same principle. It burnt its bridges. And by taking that deliberate action, the sub-game perfect outcome of the game has changed, and it's changed in favour of the incumbent firm. If you think about many of those games that we play, many of the interactions that we're involved with others, these have a long-term nature. We repeatedly interact with certain individuals. But all the games that we've looked at so far have ignored this idea of repeated interactions. And when we repeat these games with individuals, we have the possibility to build up reputations and relationships with our fellow players. But every single game that we've studied so far has completely ignored this. What we've looked at have been single-shot games. Players have come together, they played the game just the once, and then they've left. There's been absolutely no repeating of these games. However, what this does, though, is it ignores the possibility that players can build up long-term relationships. In these games that we repeatedly play with individuals, these repeated interactions with individuals, we have the possibility of taking advantage of our fellow players. But we choose not to. We don't exploit short-term games for the fear that it's going to affect our long-run payoffs. And that aspect there is the exact thing that I want to tease out here in this next topic of repeated games. And in particular, how repeating a Prince's Dilemma over a number of times potentially affects the outcome. And that is what your assignment is all about. Got the Prisoner's Dilemma, we know what happened. We play it once, we get a very specific Nash equilibrium where players choose not to cooperate with one another. That's the point about the Prisoner's Dilemma. It's a game of cooperation. Do you cooperate with your fellow players? If you play it just once, the answer is no. All the incentives in the game are to defect, are to shirk, are not to cooperate. And that's our Nash equilibrium. Well, what happens if we play it repeatedly? If you play it more than once, where there's the possibility of building up a relationship with your fellow player, of establishing a reputation? Is it possible that we could get a different outcome? That is what we're going to do in this topic. Now, I've introduced you to the idea of a repeated game, but whenever, absolutely whenever, in game theory, you talk about repeated games, you instantly need to draw that distinction between games that are played a finite number of times and games that are played infinitely. So games that are played a finite number of times, I mean we play them a very, very specific number of times. And the players know that. They will know at some point in time that they are playing the game for the last time. That is a finitely repeated game. Contrast that to infinitely repeated games, where players play the game an infinite number of times. And whenever we talk about repeated games, that's the first question that you need to ask yourself. Because there are big differences in these outcomes when they're played finitely or an infinite number of times. And it's this latter class of game, these infinitely repeated games, that we're going to look at initially. So, with that in mind then, I want to throw a question out to you. Got a game. Is it possible to repeat it infinitely? Now, we might be able to repeat it a very, very, very large number of times, but that's not the same as repeating it infinitely. So this is the type of game we're going to look at. We need to repeat it infinitely. We might repeat it 1,000,000 times, 2,000,000 times. Well, 2,000,000 is a definite number. That's a finitely repeated game. Repeat it infinitely, you've got to keep on repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. And these interactions must never, ever stop. So if you think about it, that's going to be pretty difficult. How on earth could we repeat a game an infinite number of times? Not just a very large number of times, an infinite number of times. Well, to help you resolve how we can do this, let's put it in the context of this following example. Let's say that there are two firms, and these two firms are involved in a business relationship. And this business relationship means that they have ongoing interactions with one another. And these business interactions can be easily modelled as a game, in a game theoretic setting. So, we then say to these two firms, do you expect to be trading with the other firm next year? And I'm just going to throw some possible answers out here, but just to give you an idea of what we mean by an infinitely repeated game. So if we said to these two firms, yeah, you've got this relationship, you trade with one another, do you still expect to be trading with the other firm this time next year? And a very, very plausible response is, well, yes we do. See, absolutely no reason why we shouldn't. And that's an entirely plausible response. This time next year. But now what I want to do is take that time horizon and just move it further into the future. So we then take these exact two firms and we say to them, well, okay, you're currently trading with each other, you've got this relationship, but do you still expect to be trading with one another in 5 years' time? Like, well, it's highly likely. It's a distinct possibility. So we've moved it out, but these firms still think it's likely that they're going to have this ongoing relationship. Let's put that window out even more. What happens if the timescale were 10 years' time? Because, well, these firms, well, an awful lot can happen between now and in 10 years' time. Are we still going to be in business? Is the other firm going to still be in business? So, will we still be trading in 10 years' time? Well, the answer, well, it's possible. And what happens if we put out to 20 years? Again, the response might be, well, who knows? So many things could happen. We've got no way of knowing whether we will still be involved in this business relationship, our ongoing relationship, in 20 years' time. And all of those responses, I would hope that you don't look at those and you say, there's nothing contentious there. That seems a very plausible and logical set of responses. So, we know it. There's no way. You just cannot play a game an infinite number of times. You cannot repeat it an infinite number of times. We know it, and these firms here in this relationship, they also know it. There's no way that their relationship could ever be repeated infinitely. So what's the point of these responses? Well, what's one word that I haven't said there? The one word I haven't said is no. Rationality dictates there is no way that a game can be repeated an infinite number of times. But look at those responses here. Not once did the firm say, no, we don't expect to be traded. And that's the point of it. We know, logically, we cannot repeat this game an infinite number of times, but it's very difficult to say exactly when this game will be played for the final time. We don't know when the game is going to end. These two firms don't know when their business relationship is going to end. And that's what we require for an infinitely repeated game. Logic dictates that it cannot be repeated infinitely, but the firms or players play the game over a seemingly infinite horizon. That is, they play the game, they don't know when it's going to end. So they cannot say at any point in time, we're playing this game for the very, very last time. If there's always a possibility that the game would be played again, that is what's required for an infinitely repeated game. So a phrase I often quote to you is an infinitely repeated game is a game that's played over a seemingly infinite horizon. It's not over an infinite horizon, because it can't be. But seemingly. Firms never know, or players never know, that they're playing the game for the last time. That is what makes it an infinitely repeated game. And it's this type of game, played over this seemingly infinite horizon, that we're going to start off with today. So before I give you your break then, just to get you to copy this down, just to reinforce this, this is the prisoner's dilemma. Okay? This is the sort of way that we've set it up previously. Okay? So, we've got player 1 and player 2. And everything that I'll take through the example for today, I will use the descriptors. Are these players cooperating with each other, or are they choosing to defect? Cooperate or defect. That's the point of the prisoner's dilemma. Do you cooperate with your fellow player, or do you not cooperate? Do you defect? In terms of the one where we saw it literally was the prisoners when they're arrested by police, do you confess or do you deny? Confess means that you defect, that you're not cooperating. Deny, that's the cooperation part. So this game is all in terms of cooperation. So, what do we know about the prisoner's dilemma when we play it in a single shot setting? That there's a single Nash equilibrium. There is a dominant strategy where players do not choose to cooperate with one another. So in this game here, there's a dominant strategy to defect. So player 1 will always find it optimal to defect. 3 is greater than 2. 1 is greater than 0. So player 1 will always defect. And in the same way, player 2 will always defect. 3 is greater than 2. 1 is greater than 0. And hence, our Nash equilibrium is in the bottom right-hand corner. Both players choose their dominant strategy, and the Nash equilibrium is for both players to defect. And this unique Nash equilibrium that we find is Pareto inferior to that outcome there. If only the players could choose to cooperate, they would both be better off. This would be a Pareto improvement. And that is the starting point. That's what happens in a single shot setting. So if we play this game just the once, there is no ambiguity. We know exactly what the outcome is. There is no cooperation. So think about, that's what we said initially. That players, what are they doing in this game? They're thinking about themselves. They're exploiting their fellow player for their own personal short-term gains. That's what happens when we play in a single shot setting. Now though, we're going to repeat it over a seemingly infinite horizon. And in the preamble to this topic. What did I say? I said the fact that when players do play games repeatedly, there's the possibility of building up reputations and relationships. And often, in these types of settings, we forego short-term gains because it will affect our long-term payoff. So, this is our prisoner's dilemma. We know what happens if we play it just the once. What we're going to do over the course of today's lecture, once we've identified when we have identified a Nash equilibrium previously in our single shot game, it's been a very, very specific outcome. So I think we're now going to be repeating over a seemingly infinite horizon. We're playing this game a seemingly infinite number of times. What you should appreciate is there isn't going to be a single Nash equilibrium here. Potentially, there could be an infinite number of Nash equilibria. Again, it all boils back down to this point, though, that the players want to choose an optimal strategy. Want to choose a strategy that is a best response, given what the other player is doing. Well, if you're playing over a seemingly infinite horizon, your fellow players could choose a virtually infinite number of strategies. And so by extension, there would be virtually an infinite number of Nash equilibria. So bear that in mind, okay? And if that's the case, you can see we're not going to be able to set up a very, very formal way of identifying a specific Nash equilibrium. But it's why all the time when I set the course up, when I set up this idea of a Nash equilibrium, so look, forget the mechanics, think about what that really, really means. So, if you've taken that on board, and you do appreciate now what a Nash equilibrium is, what we now do in this lecture should be an awful lot easier for you. So, what do you want to do? To identify, this is what it boils down to. If we play this game just once, we know what the Nash equilibrium is. And that Nash equilibrium is where players don't cooperate. However, is it possible, if we play this game over a seemingly infinite horizon, is it possible, not saying it's guaranteed, but is it just possible that we could arrive at an outcome, a Nash equilibrium, where the players do cooperate with one another? That's going to be the flow, that's going to be the logic of this next lecture. So, starting point then, is to say, let's assume that one of the players adopts a very, very specific strategy. Adopts a very specific long-term strategy. And this long-term strategy is to cooperate with the other player as long as that other player also cooperates. So we've got our two players here, player 1 and player 2. And let's say, for example, player 1 will always choose to cooperate with player 2, adopt this long-term strategy of cooperating with player 2, as long as player 2 is also cooperating with him. So that's the first part of his long-term strategy. If your rival cooperates, you will also cooperate. But this is the second part. If at any point in time your rival chooses not to cooperate, that is, your rival chooses to defect, you then choose to defect for each and every period from there onwards. You never revert back to cooperation. You will then always defect. So you choose to cooperate with the other player if they cooperate with you. But if at any instant in time that player chooses to defect, you then switch to defecting, and it doesn't matter what the other player does, you will always choose to defect for the rest of the game, for infinity. So that is a very specific strategy, a very specific long-term strategy that one of the players could adopt. Choose to cooperate. As soon as defection occurs, you defect for here on after. So that's a very specific strategy. What we now want to ask ourselves, and this comes back to that notion of a Nash equilibrium. So if one of the players is adopting that strategy, what do we need for the Nash equilibrium? Well, we need to find the optimal strategy of the other player. So if one of the players is adopting that strategy, what is the optimal response of the other? And I just want to throw at you a few possibilities. Okay, because this is what it all boils down to. For the Nash equilibrium, we need to find optimal responses. So, one player is doing that. What should the other player do in response to that strategy? Well, let's say that the other player chose to cooperate all of the time. And that was their response to the strategy. They'll always choose to cooperate. Well, if they're always choosing to cooperate, the other player has adopted that long-term strategy. There you go. You're going to get a payoff of 2. The outcome would be where both players cooperate and both players receive a payoff of 2. So that's what would happen if the response was to cooperate. In every single period, you get a payoff of 2. But then, this is the prisoner's dilemma. And there is a dilemma. Because if you cooperate, you'll get a payoff of 2. But what happens if you choose to defect? If you choose not to cooperate with your fellow player, you get a higher payoff. You're going to get a payoff of 3. If your rival is choosing to cooperate, and you cooperate, you get a payoff of 2. But if your rival chooses to cooperate and you defect, you get a payoff of 3. And so that's the incentive, not to cooperate and get that higher payoff of 3 as opposed to 2. But there's a problem with that, because we said the other player is adopting that long-term strategy, cooperate, as long as your fellow player cooperates, but then at any point in time, if you choose to defect, the other player will defect here on inwards. So, yes, you get a 3 for one period, but after that, your rival switches to defecting. And so, the best payoff that you can get is then going to be only 1. Now think about what that means in terms of that long-term payoff stream. If you choose to cooperate all the time, your payoffs would be 2 in each and every period. If, though, at any point in time you choose to defect, you get a higher payoff at that point in time, but thereon after, you only get a payoff of 1. So that just looks at the payoff streams into the future. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that people are impatient. As a species, humans, we are biologically engineered to be impatient. Go back to the days of prehistory, and the hazard of death was so high that genetically we are an impatient species. Think about when we did intermediate micro, when we looked at intertemporal choice. One of the central tenets of intertemporal choice is that individuals are impatient. So, there's no ambiguity here. As a species, we would rather have things today as opposed to tomorrow. We are impatient. But it doesn't matter how impatient you are. Look at these 2 streams here. That stream of 2s is going to be greater than that stream of 1s, unless the only reason that payoff stream there would be greater was if your discount rate was so high. That is the value that you place on anything other than the here and now. So if you've got a very, very high discount rate, you don't care about the future, you're only concerned about the present. You're only concerned about that 3 as opposed to that 2. Or you could think that the probability, the chances of this game continuing are really, really small. If you're convinced that you're going to die, you're not concerned about tomorrow, you're only concerned about today. But with the exception of these 2 very, very extreme scenarios, you either think that the game is going to finish with a high probability, or you've got a ridiculously high discount rate. For all other plausible assumptions, we can see that this stream of payoffs here, where you get that continuous stream of 2s, is going to be greater than that stream of payoffs there. So what does that suggest? That would suggest that an optimal response to the player choosing initially to confess and then to defect if the other player defects. So that chosen long-term strategy. An optimal response to that would be to cooperate all of the time. Because if you cooperate all of the time, you get this higher stream of long-term payoffs. But that's just one possible scenario. I've said if you cooperate all the time, but if both players adopted this exact same sort of punishment strategy, that you choose to cooperate until the other player defects, if they both adopted the exact same punishment strategy, what would that result in? That would result in cooperation all the time. Players would always cooperate with each other, would always get that payoff of 2. So again, that would be an optimal response. But that's of both players. So you can see here, what we've identified is a Nash equilibrium. If both players adopted this particular punishment strategy, you cooperate until you defect, and then defect forever onwards. If they both adopted that strategy, the optimal response of the other would also be to adopt the same strategy. And hence, that strategy pair where they both follow this punishment strategy is a Nash equilibrium. Neither player has an incentive to deviate. Neither player has an incentive to do anything different. And why is that nice? Well, think about it. The preamble that I started with. I said that we are repeatedly involved with the same individuals. We've got the opportunity to exploit them, but we choose not to. It's not in our nature to have repeated interactions with individuals and just relentlessly exploit short-term gains. Cooperation is a feature of these ongoing relationships. And yet, if you look at the idea of the prisoner's dilemma in a single shot setting, that is complete and utterly missed. We just do not get any cooperation. And yet, if we now repeat it over this seemingly infinite horizon, what outcome do we get? What Nash equilibrium is there a possibility? Well, we can get a Nash equilibrium where the players choose to cooperate with each other. They adopt strategies that are mutually supportive and do not relentlessly exploit short-term gains. And that, intuitively, is appealing. And that was the problem with the Prisoner's Dilemma when we played it just the once. It doesn't really accord with what we know about humans, that we've got this inherent need to cooperate with our fellow players. But it's only playing it repeatedly, this Nash equilibrium, where the players do cooperate, is apparent. And itself, that's a much more appealing and intuitive outcome of this game of the Prisoner's Dilemma. However, what I've done here is I've identified one Nash equilibrium. I said where they adopt that strategy pair, where they both adopt that same punishment strategy. That's one Nash equilibrium. But there are multiple Nash equilibria in this game. And just to throw another one at you. Let's say one of the players adopted the long-term strategy to defect all the time. Doesn't matter what the other player does, that player would never, ever choose to cooperate. They would always defect. Well, if your rival is adopting that long-term strategy of never cooperate, regardless, what would your optimal response be? It would also be to defect also. Hence, if your rival is going to defect all the time, your optimal response would also be to defect all of the time, never to cooperate. And that is another Nash equilibrium. If your rival is going to defect, the best thing that you can do is also defect all of the time. And so, those two long-term strategies of always defecting, again, is another Nash equilibrium outcome. So you can see, all I've done is give you an example of two, but there will be a whole host of potential Nash equilibrium. And much work has been conducted in the area of experimental economics, looking at various long-term strategies and seeing which one of them come to dominate, seeing which one of them give the highest outcomes. And 3 well-discussed and well-used strategies in the available literature and the areas of experimental economics are these following here. A grim trigger strategy, a limited punishment trigger strategy, or a tit-for-tat strategy. Well, this grim trigger, we've already seen. That was that long-term punishment strategy that I showed you, where you choose to cooperate and then defection triggers the punishment. And this punishment to defect is grim. It's relentless. There is absolutely no possibility of going back to cooperation. So that would be an example of a grim trigger strategy. So punishment, defection triggers the punishment, and the punishment is relentless or grim. Now, a less draconian version of that might be something like the following. Now, it's still a punishment strategy, and it's still a punishment, so I see some of you looking a bit bemused. What we're going to do, we're going to look at that next one, which is a limited punishment trigger. Just give you an idea about what I mean by that. So we've covered the grim trigger. That's when the punishment is relentless. A less draconian version of that is where you might initially choose to cooperate as long as the other player chooses to cooperate. So that's exactly the same as our grim trigger. No difference whatsoever. However, if at any point in time the other player chooses to defect, chooses not to cooperate with you, that then triggers the punishment. And the punishment is to defect for the next 3 periods. Then after that, then you revert back to cooperation. So, in essence, that's the same as our grim trigger strategy, that you choose to cooperate, defection by the other player triggers the punishment, but what this one allows for is for cooperation to be re-established. Now, I've thrown in an example here of 3 periods. Sometimes that might be too lenient. Other times it might be too harsh. It all depends upon the nature of the games, the players involved, the potential payoffs that the players can get, and what punishment needs to be put in place to reinforce the idea of cooperation. But it's going to depend upon the nature of the game. However, what's much more transparent though, much more appealing, is that third strategy that I gave you, that tit-for-tat strategy, where the length of the punishment depends upon what the other players are doing within the game. So tit-for-tat would look something like the following. Dominic, again, I'll put a formal definition down, but I would imagine you know exactly what it means. You just mimic what your other player did. That's all it is. Whatever they do, you do it. If they cooperate, you cooperate. If they defect, you defect. It's as simple as that. So formally, that's what it would be. But the length of the punishment depends, there you go, there's the game. The length of the punishment depends upon what the other player is doing. So you start off by cooperating. The other player cooperates with you, you cooperate with them. If at any point they choose to defect, that's what you do. You punish them for their defection. But you only punish them for as long as they choose to defect. If they revert back to cooperation, in the same way as we saw with the limited punishment strategy, there's the possibility of cooperation being re-established. It's a forgiving strategy. You don't punish the other player relentlessly. So that is tit for tat. So these are 3 strategies that are often used and often discussed in the literature within this area of experimental economics. Now, a great deal of research has been done in laboratory experiments trying to find out for these various strategies Which ones are the best? Which ones give the highest long-term outcomes? So we've identified that they're Nash equilibria, but which ones are better? Which ones give superior outcomes? That's the next part that I want to look at here. And there's a great deal of experimental evidence out there, both with animals and human subjects. So rather than just giving you a simple idea of human experiments, I just want to change it slightly and give you a rendition of an experiment that's been conducted, a well-reported experiment that's been conducted with animals, just for a slightly different flavour on it. But just to show you how this idea of tit for tat is very, very effective. And in these various experiments, it doesn't really matter what they are. Tit for tat, even though it's really simple, is one that comes to dominate. So, this particular example that I'm going to give you relates to sticklebacks. And what a stickleback is, it's a very, very small fish. And sticklebacks in the wild are preyed upon by much larger fish. And what they will do is they approach much larger fish to get information on them. But they'll typically do this in pairs. And they will take it in turns to move closer and closer to the prey fish. And the reason they want to get closer and closer is they want to find out something about the fish. For example, is it hungry? So, the closer they get, the more information they can find out about those prey fish. But take it in turns. And the way that they operate in the wild is they move in pairs. And one will move forward, and then another will move forward. And then one moves forward, and the other moves forwards. And this sort of idea of moving forward or not moving forward can be easily modelled, easily set up in terms of a prisoner's dilemma, where we've got these stickleback, and if they're moving forward with their fellow fish, that's cooperating. But if they're holding back, that's defecting. So again, that's a way that naturally the actions, now we're not saying that stickleback choose to do these things. For them it's something that's genetically. That's something that's genetically pre-programmed in them. That's just the way that they behave. So, this is the idea. That's the way that they behave. Naturally, they adopt this sort of strategy. Do they cooperate or do they defect? Do they move with their fellow player or not? Okay? So, that's the basic setup. So, the way in which these have been tested in laboratory experiments is get a tank. One side of the tank you put something that preys on stickleback, something like a perch, a large predator fish. In the other side of the tank you put a single stickleback. Now a pane of glass is put between the two fish, just in case the stickleback gets a bit too close and the experiment needs to be repeated. So that's the basic setup. Tank, got the perch in one end, what the stickleback can see, separated by a pane of glass. So in one run of the experiment, a mirror is put on the side of the tank. And so when the stickleback is in the tank, it can see its reflection. So it believes that it's got a fellow fish in the tank with it. And every time that it moves forward, it sees its reflection moving forward. So it thinks that its action of moving closer towards the fish is being reciprocated, that its fellow fish is cooperating with it. So as it moves forward, its fellow moves forward. It moves forward again, and the fellow moves forward. And doing that, it will then edge closer and closer towards that large predator fish. So that's one run of the experiment. Now, in the alternative run, exactly the same setup, but that mirror is put at a slight angle. And putting that mirror at a slight angle means that every time the stickleback moves forward, it gets the impression that its rival is progressively hanging further and further back. So it's not cooperating, it's defective. And what do we find in these sorts of experiments? Well, these experiments where the stickleback's reflection mimics its own action, it gets much, much closer to the predator fish. So when it adopts this tit-for-tat strategy, this reciprocal altruism. If you cooperate with me, I'll cooperate with you. That's entirely consistent with this idea of a tit-for-tat strategy. You cooperate, I'll cooperate. But if you defect, I'll defect. That's exactly what these sticklebacks do naturally in the wild. And so that run of the experiment, where as one fish moves forward, its reflection also moves forward, it gets much, much closer to the predator fish. So its payoffs are greater. Now this is just one example. There could be a whole host. There are a whole host of these sort of experiments reported with humans, with animals, in economics, experimentalomics, in evolution biology. But it's a very, very strong finding that tit for tat tends to give the highest payoff of all the potential strategies you could think of. And if we think about it, it should. Tit for tat embodies 4 basic principles that any effective long-term strategy should have. The first policy, principle of any strategy is it needs to be clear. And tit for tat is as simple as you can get. All you're doing is you're mimicking what the other person does. You're just copying them. You can't get much simpler and clearer than that. So that's the first principle that any effective strategy should embody. And you can see it's a principle that tit for tat perfectly embodies. I'm not sure if niceness is a word, but there you go. An effective strategy should also exhibit niceness. Well, you can Google it, and if it's not, it's just a made-up word by me. But you get the basic idea that an effective strategy should be nice. It shouldn't initiate defection. If defection, non-cooperation does occur, it's not from the person who's adopting that tit-for-tat strategy. So in that sense, it's a nice strategy. It doesn't initiate defection. However, if defection does occur, what an effective strategy needs to be is provocable. It cannot leave defection unpunished. And tit for tat will do exactly that. It's provocable. If you defect, the response of the other player will be mimicked. Punishment will always follow defection. And again, you need that for any effective strategy. It needs to be provocable. And then lastly, it also needs to be forgiving. And tit for tat is forgiving. That, okay, a player might make a mistake, they don't cooperate, but if they go back to cooperation, tit for tat says, it's not a problem. We'll go back to cooperation and we'll maintain these long-term higher payoffs. So in that sense, tit for tat perfectly embodies these 4 principles here. It would seem to suggest then that tit for tat is the absolutely perfect long-term strategy. It doesn't really seem to have many drawbacks. Well, it does have one serious drawback. I mean, it does not change any of those 4 principles here. They will never change. Tit for tat really does embody all of those. But the problem with tit for tat is that the slightest possibility of misconception, misconstruing, misreading, misunderstanding what your fellow players are doing can utterly undermine, utterly break down the effectiveness of tit for tat as a successful long-term strategy. And I'll give you an example to illustrate. Everyone finished with that bullet point, by the way? Yeah? If there's the slightest possibility of a misconception, tit for tat totally and utterly disintegrates as an effective strategy. An example that I'll give you to illustrate this point comes from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the text by Mark Twain. And in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there are 2 families. We have the Grangerford family and we have the Shepherdson family. And if you read the book, these 2 families are at war with each other. They have an ongoing feud. But if the protagonists from both of these families are asked, well, who started this feud between the families? Or indeed, what is this feud all about? None of them know. They don't know where it started, they don't know what it's all about. But it's the need to get your retaliation in, to retaliate against the other family, that then becomes overarching. That's the only consideration for the families. They don't know what the feud's about, they don't know who started, but it makes no difference. And this is the problem. This is the destructive nature of tit for tat. So, how did this start? Well, let's say, merely as an example, let's say that the two families are initially on amicable terms, but they're friends with each other. And then, for some reason, there's something that's done by one of the families that perceived as an act of aggression. Now, no bad intent was meant, but it's just misconstrued. It's been misread. It's seen as an act of aggression from one of the families. So what is the other family going to do? Well, you've slighted us. You've initiated this aggression against us. The other family will naturally respond by retaliating against them. So if you attack us, we'll attack you. It's that old mafia maxim. If you hit us, we'll hit you. And that's the exact thing here. That's what the family does. They respond to that perceived act of aggression by retaliating themselves. But what about the initial family? They didn't think that they started anything off, and suddenly, for no reason at all, they've been attacked. So what do? They then retaliate. And then what does the other family do? They then retaliate back. And you can see this whole cycle of retaliation starts off. And every family will want to, or both of the families will want to continue this until they feel as if they're even, as if they've got their retaliation in. So what tit for tat, and this is the problem of adhering to a strict tit for tat strategy, that you always do back to your rival what your rival has then done to you. But once this cycle of retaliation has started, it doesn't possess a way to look, that's it, let's just stop it. Let's go back to cooperation. And this is particularly problematic in this sort of idea when actions are misconstrued. That it's a strategy that's too easily provoked. And once that cycle of retaliation starts, it's very, very difficult to stop. And that in itself is what undermines totally the effectiveness of tit for tat. And if you start thinking about the real world in which we live, that idea of misconstruing, not being able to perfectly observe what your rival's done, doesn't that accord perfectly with the nature of the world in which we live? And I'll give you an example to illustrate that. So, we're going to return back to this idea of the repeated prisoner's dilemma. Now, what does it involve? If we want cooperation, we need to give players the right incentives. And if you don't cooperate, you'll be punished. But what happens if your rivals can't perfectly observe what you do? Again, going back to that example of the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords. You can't perfectly observe what your rival's doing, and so a cycle of retaliation will start. Therefore, there's no scope for a long-term cooperative strategy. So, this is the problem. How do you detect, how do you perfectly observe what your rival's doing? Isn't that always the case? Well, in the real world it isn't. And if we can't observe what our rivals are doing, we can't possibly hope to sustain long-term cooperation. So, I'll give you an example, all related around this idea, again, of prisoner's dilemma and cooperation. And I'll dress it up in terms of the OPEC countries. Now, the OPEC countries, what do? Well, they're a cartel, they get together, and they have production quotas. They will determine the world supply of oil to maximise their joint profits. They'll each individually be given a production quota, and each of the individual members of OPEC will be committed, supposedly, to producing their production quota and nothing more. And this will maximise profits for the entire OPEC consortium, the entire OPEC cartel. So let's say each of the countries in OPEC has been given their production quotas, they're sticking to them, and this means that the world price of oil is at $75 per barrel. So that's the collusive price. That's the price that maximises the joint profits for all of the OPEC members, which is fine. Now imagine you're the Kuwaitis, and I'll use this merely as an example of one of the members of OPEC. So imagine you're the Kuwaitis. You say, well, okay, we've got our production quota, we can produce that, and we can get $75 per barrel. But what we could do is we could produce more than our quota. We could produce what we want. And if we do that, we produce more oil, we're going to make higher profits. The problem is, though, in that producing more, it forces the price of oil down. There's more oil on the world market, its price comes down. So, if it sticks to its production quota, the barrel price of oil is $75. If it busts its quota, it will force the price down. But Kuwait don't mind because they're making extra profits, because they're producing more oil. Now the problem is, though, this price drop from $75 to $70 per barrel will be observed by the oil producing community. And all the OPEC members will see that. The problem is, they don't know who's produced that extra oil. Now the Kuwaitis aren't going to admit to it. And even if someone asked them and said, did you produce too much oil? No, it wasn't us, it was the Libyans, it was Nigerians, it was the Venezuelans, it was anyone, it just was not us. And there's not an awful lot that could be proved, because whilst prices are easily observed, output isn't. Now this is the problem. What did we say previously? That in order to sustain cooperation in the long term, you need the threat of sanctions. If you don't cooperate with your fellow players, you will be punished. That's the only way of sustaining long-term cooperation. So what does that mean then? In this OPEC example, there you go, someone isn't cooperating. Therefore, someone needs to be punished. But who's going to be punished? OPEC doesn't know that it's Kuwaitis. Therefore, any punishment or sanctions will have to be blunt, and they will have to affect both guilty and innocent alike. If you don't have sanctions, there is no threat to make people cooperate. Therefore, you need sanctions. But sanctions here would have to affect guilty and innocent alike. So you imagine the incentive that gives to all of the other countries apart from Kuwait. They're religiously sticking to producing their production quotas. They are sustaining long-term cooperation. And then suddenly, they're hit with sanctions. Not for something that they've done, but for something somebody else has done. What sort of atmosphere does that create? That mistrust and resentment are bound to follow. If that's the case, cooperation will flounder. But it's even worse than that. What causes the price of oil to fluctuate? Now, we've talked about supply side factors, increases or decreases in the supply of oil. But what about demand side factors? These are just as important. These can have just as large and profound effects upon the price of oil. Again, think of the incentive that this gives the Kuwaitis. They can produce as much oil as they possibly want. And when the world price of oil falls down, they say, well, nothing at all to do with us. This has just been caused by demand side factors. And again, there's nothing to prove anything different. So the Kuwaitis would have absolutely no incentive to cooperate, to stick to their production quota. But it's not just the Kuwaitis, everyone else has the exact same incentive not to cooperate. And again, this is the problem. Now, when we introduce that idea about tit for tat and that unobservability of outcomes, it then opens up a much, much wider range of problems within these sorts of games. That if you want cooperation, you've got to be able to observe outcomes. And if you can't observe outcomes, you can't have long-term cooperation. There's just no way that long-term cooperation can be sustained. Now, the last thing for today, as if that wasn't complicated enough though, Now, we've talked about competition in a very, very simple sense. I gave you that OPEC example, so look, stick to your production quotas, yes or no. But in the real world, competition takes on many forms. And firms can compete, obviously, on price, but they can also compete with each other on things like product quality or after-sales service. Now, a cartel that tries to force cooperation in things like price, okay, price is easily observed. You can tell what price your fellow firms are charging. But cartels that try to set prices, cooperate on prices, will then find competition breaking out in other areas that are much more difficult to observe. And an excellent example of this is what happened in the US airline industry. Now, before 1978, the airline industry in the US was highly, highly regulated. It was effectively a legally enforced cartel. It was run by the Civil Aviation Authority, and the prices of fares that airlines could charge were fixed. They were fixed by the federal societies. And the entry of new firms into the market was restricted. So airlines couldn't come in and set up in competition. So for all intents and purposes, it was a legally enforced cartel. And these firms had to cooperate on price. They had no other choice. So what do you think happened? Well, they're not allowed to cooperate, or they have to cooperate on price. They can't compete against each other. They can't charge different prices. Those are set by the Federal Aviation Authority. So what happened? Competition would then break out in other areas that are less apparent. So because they couldn't compete on price, they then looked for less visible means. Initially, they then started offering more elaborate meals for travellers. They also started competing with each other on more attractive cabin staff. But then, when labour laws were introduced that forced airlines to hire male stewards, when it forced them to stop firing females once they reached the age of 30, therefore, they moved to something else. Therefore, they looked at the width of seats or leg rooms. You can see, that's the whole point about this. That competition can only be restricted if you can perfectly observe the outcomes of your rivals. And while certain outcomes can be easily observed, not all of them can. In the real world, this is the problem with maintaining long-term cooperation. So, bringing all of this together then, what have we found in today's lecture? For a prisoner's dilemma, and the important part about a prisoner's dilemma is, can we sustain long-term cooperation? Do you cooperate with your rivals? Can long-term cooperation be achieved if we play over a seemingly infinite horizon? Well, the answer is yes. But just because we play this game over a seemingly infinite horizon, in itself does not guarantee that cooperation will be forthcoming. Within a repeated prisoner's dilemma, you need to give people the right incentives not to cheat. There's always an incentive to cheat. But you need to give them the right incentives. And these will be in terms of not just the benefits that they get to cooperation, but the penalties that they will face if cooperation is not forthcoming. But again, because of all these issues that we raised about observability of outcomes, etc., this is what makes it very, very difficult. But again, relating to this also about adoption of an effective long-term strategy. There is no single long-term strategy. We're going to think of a whole multitude of long-term strategies that do support cooperation. However, this is the important part. It's not just repeating it over a seemingly infinite horizon. Players must also be given, so that's that part there, the right incentives not to cheat. The sanctions, the threats need to be there. And if they're not credible, if you can't observe what the failed players are doing, this incentive to cooperate completely evaporates.